Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter number 61, Cordoba and Granada, June 16, 1932. We have journeyed on in Asia and Europe through the years, and we have halted at the end of 1,000 years after Christ and had a look back. But Spain has somehow been left out of our account. Spain under the Arabs, and we must go back and fit her into the picture. Something you know already, if you still remember it. It was Ahai 711 AC that the Arab general crossed to Spain from Africa. He was Tariq, and he landed at Gibraltar, the Jabal-ut-Tariq, the Rock of Tariq. Within 2 years, the Arabs had conquered the whole of Spain, and a little later, Portugal was added. They went on and on, marched into France, and spread all over the south. Thoroughly frightened at this, the Franks and other tribes joined together under Charles Martel and made a great effort to stop the Arabs. They succeeded, and at the Great Battle of Tours near Poitiers in France, the Franks defeated the Arabs. It was a great defeat and put an end to Arab dreams of the conquest of Europe. Many times after that, the Arabs and the Franks and other Christian people in France fought each other. And sometimes the Arabs won and entered France, and sometimes they were pushed back in Spain. Even Charlemagne attacked them in Spain, but he was defeated. On the whole, however, for a long period the balance was kept up, and the Arabs ruled in Spain but went no further. Spain was thus made part of the great Arab Empire, which spread right across Africa to the borders of Mongolia. But not for long. You will remember that there was civil war in Arabia, and the Abbasides pushed out the Umayyad caliphs. The Arab governor in Spain was an Umayyad, and he refused to recognize the new Abbasid caliph. So Spain cut itself off from the Arab Empire, and the caliph at Baghdad was too far away and too full of his own troubles to do anything in the matter. But bad blood continued between Spain and Baghdad, and the two Arab states, instead of helping each other in the hour of trial, rather welcomed the difficulties of each other. It was somewhat rash of the Spanish Arabs to break loose from their homeland. They were in a far country amid an alien population and were surrounded by enemies. They were small in numbers. In the event of danger and difficulty, there was no one to help them. But in those days, they were full of self-confidence and cared little for these dangers. As a matter of fact, they did remarkably well in spite of the continuous pressure of the Christian nations in the north. And, single-handed, they maintained their dominion over the greater part of Spain for 500 years. Even after this, they managed to hold on to a smaller kingdom in the south of Spain for another 200 years. And so, they actually outlasted the great empire of Baghdad. And the city of Baghdad itself had long been reduced to dust when the Arabs said their last farewell to Spain. These 700 years of Arab rule in parts of Spain are surprising enough. But what is more interesting is the high civilization and culture of the Spanish Arabs, or Moors as they were called. A historian, carried away by his enthusiasm a little, has said that the Moors organized that wonderful kingdom of Cordoba, which was the marvel of the Middle Ages, and which, when all Europe was plunged in barbaric ignorance and strife, alone held the torch of learning and civilization bright and shining before the Western world. Cordoba was the capital of this kingdom for just 500 years. This is usually called Cordoba in English, sometimes Cordoba. I am afraid I have a way of spelling the same name differently at times, but I shall try to stick to Cordoba. This was a great city of 1 million inhabitants, a garden city 10 miles in length, with 24 miles of suburbs. There are said to have been 60,000 palaces and mansions, 200,000 smaller houses, 80,000 shops, 3,800 mosques, and 700 public baths. These figures may be exaggerations, but they give some idea of the city. There were many libraries. The chief of these, the Imperial Library of the Emir, containing 400,000 books. The University of Cordoba was famous all over Europe and even in Western Asia. Free elementary schools for the poor abounded. A historian says that, in Spain, almost everybody knew how to read and write, whilst in Christian Europe, save and except the clergy, even persons belonging to the highest ranks were wholly ignorant. Such was the city of Cordoba, competing with the other great Arab city of Baghdad. Its fame spread all over Europe, and a German writer of the 10th century called it the ornament of the world. To its university came students from distant places. The influence of Arab philosophy spread to the other great universities of Europe, Paris, Oxford, and the universities of northern Italy. Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, was a famous philosopher of Cordoba in the 12th century. In his later years, he fell out with the Spanish emir and was banished. He went and settled in Paris. As in other parts of Europe, there was a kind of feudal system in Spain also. Great and powerful nobles grew up, and between them and the emir, who was the ruler, there was frequent fighting. It was this civil war which weakened the Arab state more than the attacks from outside. At the same time, the power of some small Christian states in northern Spain was growing, and they were pushing away at the Arabs. About 1000 AC, that is, just at the end of the millennium, the kingdom of the emir extended almost all over Spain. It even included a bit of southern France. But collapse came soon, and, as usual, it was due to internal weakness. The fine fabric of Arab civilization, with its arts and luxury and chivalry, was, after all, a rich man's civilization. The starving poor revolted, and there were labor riots. Gradually, civil war spread, and the provinces fell away, and the Spanish Empire of the Arabs went to pieces. Still the Arabs continued, split up as they were, and it was not till 1236 AC that Cordoba finally fell to the Christian king of Castile. The Arabs were driven south, but still they resisted. In the south of Spain, they carved out a little kingdom, the Kingdom of Granada, and held on there. It was a little affair, this kingdom, so far as size went, but it reproduced Arab civilization in miniature. The famous Alhambra still stands in Granada, with its beautiful arches and columns and arabesques, a reminder of those days. It was originally called in Arabic Al-Hamra, the Red Palace. Arabesques are the beautiful designs you often see on Arab and other buildings influenced by Islam. The painting of figures was not encouraged by Islam, so the builders took to making fancy and intricate designs. Often they wrote Arabic verses from the Quran over the arches and elsewhere and made of them a beautiful decoration. The Arabic script is a flowing script which lends itself easily to such decoration. The Kingdom of Granada lasted for 200 years. It was pressed and harassed by the Christian states of Spain, especially Castile, and sometimes it agreed to pay tribute to Castile. It would probably not have lasted so long if the Christian states had themselves not been divided. But in 1469 AC, a marriage took place between the rulers of two of these principal states, Ferdinand and Isabella, and this united Castile, Aragon, and Leon. Ferdinand and Isabella put an end to the Arab kingdom of Granada. The Arabs fought bravely for several years till they were surrounded and hemmed in Granada. Starved out, they surrendered in 1492 AC. Many of the Saracens or Arabs left Spain and went to Africa. Near Granada, overlooking the city, there is a spot which still bears the name of El Último Sospiro del Moro, the last sigh of the Moor. But a large number of Arabs remained in Spain. The treatment of these Arabs is a very dark chapter in the history of Spain. There was cruelty and massacre, and the promises made to them about toleration were forgotten. About this time, the Inquisition, that terrible weapon which the Roman Church forged to crush all who did not bow down to it, was established in Spain. Jews, who had prospered under the Saracens, were now forced to change their religion, and many were burned to death. Women and children were not spared. The infidels, that is, the Saracens, so says a historian, were ordered to abandon their picturesque costume and to assume the hat and breeches of their conquerors, to renounce their language, their customs and ceremonies, even their very names, and to speak Spanish, behave Spanishly, and rename themselves Spaniards. Of course, there were risings and revolts against these barbarities, but they were mercilessly crushed. The Spanish Christians seem to have been very much against washing and bathing. Perhaps they objected to these simply because the Spanish Arabs were very fond of them and had erected great public baths all over the place. The Christians even went so far as to issue orders for the reformation of the Moriscos or Moors or Arabs that neither themselves, their women, nor any other persons should be permitted to wash or bathe themselves either at home or elsewhere, and that all their bathing houses should be pulled down and destroyed. Apart from the sin of washing, another great charge brought against the Moriscos was that they were tolerant in religion. It is extraordinary to read of this, and yet this was one of the main charges in an account of the apostasies and treasons of the Moriscos drawn up by the Archbishop of Valencia in 1602, when he was recommending the expulsion of Saracens from Spain. Referring to this, he says that they, the Moriscos, commended nothing so much as that liberty of conscience in all matters of religion, which the Turks and all other Mohammedans suffer their subjects to enjoy. What a great compliment was thus paid unwittingly to the Saracens in Spain, and how different and intolerant was the outlook of the Spanish Christians. Millions of Saracens were driven out forcibly from Spain, mostly into Africa, some to France. But you must remember that the Arabs had been in Spain for 700 years, and during this long period, they had become to a large extent merged in the people of Spain. Originally Arabs, they had gradually become more and more Spanish. Probably the Spanish Arabs of later years were quite different from the Arabs of Baghdad. Even today, the Spanish race has much of Arab blood in its veins. The Saracens had also spread to the south of France and even to Switzerland, not as rulers, but as settlers. Sometimes even now one comes across an Arab type of face among the Frenchmen from the Midi. Thus ended not only Saracen rule in Spain, but also Arab civilization. For, even earlier, this civilization had collapsed in Asia, as we shall presently see. It influenced many countries and many cultures, and left many a bright souvenir. But it did not rise again by itself in after history. After the Saracens left, Spain, under Ferdinand and Isabella, grew in power. Soon afterwards, the discovery of America brought vast wealth to it, and for a while, it was the most powerful country in Europe, dominating others. But its fall was rapid, and it sank into insignificance, and while the other countries of Europe advanced, Spain remained stagnant, dreaming still of the Middle Ages and not realizing that the world had changed since then. An English historian, Lane Poole, writing of the Saracens in Spain, says, "For centuries, Spain had been the center of civilization, the seat of arts and sciences, of learning and every form of refined enlightenment. No other country in Europe had so far approached the cultivated dominion of the Moors. The brief brilliancy of Ferdinand and Isabella and of the empire of Charles could found no such enduring preeminence. The Moors were banished. For a while Christian Spain shone, like the moon, with a borrowed light. Then came the eclipse, and in that darkness, Spain has groveled ever since. The true memorial of the Moors is seen in desolate tracts of utter barrenness, where once the Moors grew luxuriant vines and olives and yellow ears of corn. In a stupid, ignorant population where once wit and learning flourished. In the general stagnation and degradation of a people which has hopelessly fallen in the scale of nations and has deserved its humiliation. This is a hard judgment. About a year ago, there was a revolution in Spain and the king was removed. There is a republic there now. Perhaps this young republic will do better and bring Spain again into line with other countries. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter number 62, The Crusades. June 19th, 1932. I told you in a recent letter, number 57, of the declaration by the Pope and his Church Council of a holy war against the Muslims for the recovery of the city of Jerusalem. The rising power of the Seljuk Turks frightened Europe, and especially the Constantinople government, which was directly threatened. Stories of the ill treatment of Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem and Palestine by the Turks excited the people of Europe and filled them with anger. So a holy war was declared, and the Pope and the Church called upon all the Christian peoples of Europe to march to the rescue of the holy city. Thus began the Crusades in 1095 AC. And for more than 150 years, the struggle continued between Christianity and Islam, between the cross and the crescent. There were long periods of rest in between, but there was almost a continuous state of war, and wave after wave of Christian crusaders came to fight and mostly to die in the Holy Land. This long warfare yielded no substantial results to the crusaders. For a short while, Jerusalem was in their hands, but later it went back to the Turks, and there it remained. The chief result of the Crusades was to bring death and misery to millions of Christians and Muslims, and again to soak Asia Minor and Palestine with human blood. What was the state of the Empire of Baghdad at this time? The Abbasides continued at the head of it. They were still the caliphs, the commanders of the faithful. But they were nominal heads having little power. We have already seen how their empire split up, and the provincial governors became independent. Mahmud of Ghazni, who raided India so often, was a powerful sovereign who threatened the caliph if the latter did not behave according to his wishes. Even in Baghdad itself, the Turks were really masters. Then came another branch of the Turks, the Seljuks, and they rapidly established their power and spread, victorious, to the gates of Constantinople itself. But the caliph still remained the caliph, though with no political power. He gave the title of Sultan to the Seljuk chiefs, and the Sultan ruled. The Crusaders had thus to fight against these Seljuk sultans and their followers. In Europe, the Crusades increased the idea of Christendom, the world of Christianity, as opposed to all non-Christians. Europe had a common idea and purpose: the recovery of the Holy Land from the so-called infidel. This common purpose filled people with enthusiasm, and many a man left home and property for the sake of the great cause. Many went with noble motives. Many were attracted by the promise of the Pope that those who went would have their sins forgiven. There were other reasons also for the Crusades. Rome wanted once for all to become the boss of Constantinople. You will remember that the Constantinople Church was different from that of Rome. It called itself the Orthodox Church, and it disliked the Roman Church intensely and considered the Pope an upstart. The Pope wanted to put an end to this conceit of Constantinople and to bring it within his fold. Under the cloak of a holy war against the infidel Turk, he wanted to obtain what he had long desired. That is the way of politicians and those who consider themselves statesmen. It is well to remember this conflict between Rome and Constantinople, as it continually crops up during the Crusades. Another reason for the Crusades was a commercial one. The business people, especially of the growing ports of Venice and Genoa, wanted them because their trade was suffering. The Seljuk Turks had closed many of their trade routes to the east. The common people, of course, knew nothing about these reasons. No one told them. Politicians usually hide their real reasons and talk pompously of religion and justice and truth and the like. It was so at the time of the Crusades. It is so still. People were taken in then, and still the great majority of people are taken in by the soft talk of politicians. So large numbers gathered for the Crusades. Among them were good and earnest people. But there were also many who were far from good, who were attracted by the hope of plunder. It was a strange collection of pious and religious men and the riffraff of the population, who were capable of every kind of crime. Indeed, these crusaders, or many of them, going out to serve in what was to them a noble cause, committed the vilest and most disgusting of crimes. Many were so busy with plundering and misbehaving on the way that they never reached anywhere near Palestine. Some took to massacring Jews on the way. Some even massacred their brother Christians. Fed up with their misbehavior, sometimes the peasantry of the Christian countries they passed through rose and attacked them, killing many and driving the others away. The Crusaders at last managed to reach Palestine under a Norman, Godfrey of Bouillon. Jerusalem fell to them, and then the carnage lasted for a week. There was a terrible massacre.
French eyewitness of this says that under the portico of the mosque, the blood was knee-deep and reached the horses' bridles.
Godfrey became king of Jerusalem. 70 years later, Jerusalem was retaken from the Christians by Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt. This excited the people of Europe again, and several crusades followed. This time, the kings and emperors of Europe came in person, but they had little success. They quarreled among themselves for precedence and were jealous of each other. It is a dismal story of ghastly and cruel war, and petty intrigue and sordid crime. But sometimes the better side of human nature prevailed over this horror, and incidents took place when enemies behaved with courtesy and chivalry to each other. Among the foreign kings in Palestine was Richard of England, Coeur de Lion, the lion-hearted, noted for his physical strength and courage. Saladin was also a great fighter and famous for his chivalry. Even the crusaders who fought Saladin came to appreciate this chivalry of his. There is a story that once Richard was very ill and was suffering from the heat. Saladin, hearing of this, arranged to send him fresh snow and ice from the mountains. Ice could not be made artificially then by freezing water, as we do now. So natural snow and ice from the mountains had to be taken by swift messengers. There are many stories of the time of the Crusades. Perhaps you have read Walter Scott's Talisman. One batch of crusaders went to Constantinople and took possession of it. They drove out the Greek emperor of the Eastern Empire and established a Latin kingdom and the Roman Church. Terrible massacres also took place in Constantinople, and the city itself was partly burnt by the Crusaders. But this Latin kingdom did not last long. The Greeks of the Eastern Empire, weak as they were, came back and drove away the Latins after a little over 50 years. The Eastern Empire of Constantinople continued for another 200 years, till 1453, when the Turks finally put an end to it. This capture of Constantinople by the Crusaders brings out the desire of the Roman Church and the Pope to extend their influence there. Although the Greeks of this city had, in a moment of panic, appealed to Rome for help against the Turks, they helped the Crusaders little and disliked them greatly. But the most terrible of all these crusades was what is called the Children's Crusade. Large numbers of young boys, chiefly French and some from Germany, in their excitement, left their homes and decided to go to Palestine. Many of them died on the way. Many were lost. Most of them reached Marseille, and there, these poor children were tricked and their enthusiasm was taken advantage of by scoundrels. Under the pretext of taking them to the Holy Land, slave traders took them on their ships, carried them to Egypt, and sold them into slavery. Richard of England, on his way back from Palestine, was captured by his enemies in Eastern Europe, and a very heavy ransom had to be paid for his release. A king of France was captured in Palestine itself and had to be ransomed. An emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick Barbarossa, was drowned in a river in Palestine. Meanwhile, as time went on, all the glamour went out of these crusades. People got fed up with them. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but the kings and people of Europe were no longer interested in wasting more lives and treasure for its recovery. Since then, for nearly 700 years, Jerusalem continued to be under the Muslims. It was only recently, during the Great War in 1918, that it was taken from the Turks by an English general. One of the later crusades was interesting and unusual. Indeed, it was hardly a crusade at all in the old sense of the word. The Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire came and, instead of fighting, had an interview with the then Sultan of Egypt, and they came to a friendly understanding. Frederick was an extraordinary person. At a time when most kings were hardly literate, he knew many languages, including Arabic. He was known as the wonder of the world. He cared little for the Pope, and the Pope thereupon excommunicated him. But this had little effect on him. The Crusades thus failed to achieve anything. But this continuous fighting weakened the Seljuk Turks. Even more than this, however, feudalism sapped the foundations of the Seljuk Empire. The big feudal lords considered themselves practically independent. They
fought each other. Sometimes they even went so far as to ask for Christian help against each other. It was this internal weakness of the Turks that played into the hands of the Crusaders sometimes. When, however, there was a strong ruler like Saladin, they made little progress. There is another view of the Crusades, a recent view put forward by the English historian G.M. Trevelyan, the author of the Garibaldi books which you know. This is interesting. The Crusades, says Trevelyan, were the military and religious aspect of a general urge towards the East on the part of the reviving energies of Europe. The prize that Europe brought back from the Crusades was not the permanent liberation of the Holy Sepulchre or the potential unity of Christendom, of which the story of the Crusades was one long negation. She brought back instead the finer arts and crafts, luxury, science, and intellectual curiosity, everything that Peter the Hermit would most have despised. Saladin died in 1193, and gradually what remained of the old Arab Empire went to pieces. In many parts of Western Asia, there was disorder under the petty feudal lords. The last crusade took place in 1249. It was headed by Louis IX, King of France, who was defeated and taken prisoner. Meanwhile, big things had been happening in Eastern and Central Asia. The Mongols, under a mighty chieftain, Chengiz or Genghis Khan, were advancing and covering the eastern horizon like a huge dark cloud. Crusader and defender, Christian and Muslim alike, saw this coming invasion with fear.
We shall deal with Chengiz and the Mongols in a later letter. One thing I should like to mention before I end this letter. In Bukhara, in Central Asia, there lived a very great Arab physician who was famous in Asia as well as Europe. His name was Ibn Sina, but he is better known in Europe as Avicenna. The Prince of Physicians, he was called. He died in 1037, before the Crusades began. I mention Ibn Sina's name because of his fame. But remember that right through this period, even when the Arab Empire was on the decline, Arab civilization continued in Western and part of Central Asia. Saladin, busy as he was fighting the Crusaders, built many colleges and hospitals. But this civilization was on the eve of a sudden and complete collapse. The Mongols were coming from the east. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter number 63, Europe at the Time of the Crusades, June 20th, 1932. I came my last letter. We saw something of the clash between Christianity and Islam in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. The idea of Christendom develops in Europe. Christianity has by this time spread all over Europe, the last comers being the Slav races of Eastern Europe, Russians and others. There is an interesting story. I do not know how far it is true, that the old Russian people, before they became Christian, discussed the question of changing their old religion and adopting a new one. The two new religions they had heard of were Christianity and Islam. So, quite in the modern style, they sent a deputation to visit the countries where these religions were practiced, to examine them and report on them. It is said that this deputation visited some places in Western Asia, where Islam prevailed, and then they went to Constantinople. They were amazed at what they saw at Constantinople. The ceremonial of the Orthodox Church was rich and gorgeous, with music and beautiful singing. The priests came in splendid garments, and there was burning of incense. This ceremonial impressed the simple and semi-civilized people from the north tremendously. Islam had nothing so gorgeous. So, they decided in favor of Christianity, and on their return, they reported accordingly to their king. The king and his people thereupon became Christians, and because they took their Christianity from Constantinople, they were followers of the Orthodox Greek Church and not of Rome. At no subsequent time did Russia acknowledge the Pope of Rome. This conversion of Russia took place long before the Crusades. The Bulgarians also, it is said, at one time were half inclined to become Mohammedans, but then the attraction of Constantinople was greater. Their king married a Byzantine princess. You will remember that Byzantium was the old name for Constantinople, and became a Christian. In the same way, other neighboring people had adopted Christianity. What was happening in Europe during these Crusades? You have seen that some of the kings and emperors journeyed to Palestine, and several of them got into trouble there. The Pope, meanwhile, sat in Rome and issued commands and appeals for the Holy War against the infidel Turk. This was the time, perhaps, when the power of the popes was at its highest. I have told you how a proud emperor stood barefooted in the snow at Canossa, waiting to be admitted to the Pope's presence to beg forgiveness. It was this Pope Gregory VII, whose previous name was Hildebrand, who had fixed up a new method for the election of popes. The cardinals were the highest priests in the Roman Catholic world. A college of cardinals was created. The Holy College, it was called. and this college elected a new pope. This was the system introduced in 1059 AC, and it has continued, perhaps with some modifications, to this day. Even now, when a pope dies, the College of Cardinals meets immediately, and they sit in a locked chamber. No one can come in or go out from that room till the election is over. Often they have sat there for many long hours, unable to agree about their choice. But they cannot come out. So they are forced to agree at last. And as soon as a choice is made, white smoke is sent up so that the waiting crowds outside can know. Just as the Pope was chosen by election, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire also came to be elected. But he was elected by the great feudal lords. There were 7 of these, the elector, princes as they were called. In this way, they tried to prevent the emperor always coming from one family. In practice, however, one family often dominated these elections for long periods. Thus we find in the 12th and 13th centuries the Hohenstaufen dynasty dominating the empire. Hohenstaufen is, I believe, some small town or village in Germany. The family originally coming from there took their name from it. Frederick I of Hohenstaufen became emperor in 1152. He is usually called Frederick Barbarossa. He it was who got drowned on his way to the Crusades. It is said that his reign was the most brilliant in the history of the empire. To the German people, he has long been a hero, a half-mythical figure round whom many legends have gathered. It is said that he sleeps in a deep cavern in a mountain, and that when the right time comes, he will wake up and come out to save his people. Against the Pope, Frederick Barbarossa carried on a great struggle. But this ended in victory for the Pope, and Frederick had to bow down to him. He was an autocratic monarch, but his great feudal vassals gave him a lot of trouble. In Italy, where large cities were growing up, Frederick tried to crush their freedom, but he did not succeed. In Germany also great cities were growing, especially on the banks of rivers. Cologne, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and many others. Here Frederick's policy was different. He supported the free German cities in order to lessen the power of the nobles and feudal lords. I have told you on several occasions what the old Indian idea of kingship was. From the old Aryan days to Ashoka's time, and from the Arthashastra to the Nitisara of Sukracharya, it is repeatedly stated that the king must bow down to public opinion. It is the public that is the ultimate master. This was the Indian theory, although in practice, kings in India, as elsewhere, were autocratic enough. Compare this to the old European view. According to the lawyers of those days, the emperor had absolute authority. His will was law. The emperor is the living law upon earth, they said. Frederick Barbarossa himself said, "It is not for the people to give laws to the prince, but to obey his command." Compare this also with the Chinese view. The emperor or king there was called by high-sounding titles, like the Son of Heaven. But this must not mislead us. In theory, his position was very different from that of the all-powerful European emperor. An old Chinese writer, Meng Tse, has written, "The people is the most important element in the country. Next come the useful gods of the soil and the crops. And last in importance comes the ruler." The emperor in Europe was thus supposed to be supreme on earth. And it was from this that the notion of the divine right of kings arose. In practice, of course, he was very far from supreme. Even his feudal vassals were turbulent enough. And gradually, as we shall see, new classes arose in the emperor, cities which claimed some share of power. On the other hand, the Pope also claimed to be supreme on earth. Where two supremes meet, there is bound to be trouble. The grandson of Frederick Barbarossa was also called Frederick. He became emperor at an early age and was called Frederick II. He was the man who was called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, and who went to Palestine and had a friendly talk with the Egyptian Sultan. He also, like his grandfather, defied the Pope and refused to obey him. The Pope retaliated by excommunicating him. This was the old and mighty weapon of the popes, but it was growing a little rusty. Frederick II cared little for the anger of the Pope, and the world also was changing. Frederick wrote long letters to all the princes and rulers of Europe, pointing out that the Pope had no business to interfere with the kings. It was the business of the popes to look after religious and spiritual matters and not to meddle with politics. He also described the corruption of the clergy. Frederick had by far the best of the argument with the popes. His letters are very interesting, as they are the first indication of the modern spirit being introduced into the old struggle between emperor and pope. Frederick II was very tolerant in religion, and Arab and Jewish philosophers came to his court. It is said that it was through him that the Arabic numerals and algebra, which you will remember came originally from India, came to Europe. He also founded the University of Naples and a great medical school at the ancient University of Salerno. Frederick II ruled from 1212 to 1250. With his death ended the Hohenstaufen control of the empire. Indeed, the empire itself practically ended. Italy fell away. Germany went to pieces, and for many years there was frightful disorder. Bobber knights and bandits plundered and looted, and there was no one to check them. The weight of the Holy Roman Empire had been too great for the German kingdom to bear. In France and England, the kings were gradually consolidating their positions and putting down the big feudal vassals who were troublesome. In Germany, the king was also emperor, and he was far too busy fighting the Pope or the Italian cities to curb his nobles. Germany had the doubtful honor of having the emperor, but it paid for this by weakness and dissension at home. France and England grew to be strong nations long before Germany was even united. For hundreds of years, there were numerous petty princes in Germany. It was only about 60 years ago that Germany was united. And even then, the little kings and princes continued. The Great War of 1914 to 18 put an end to this crowd. There was so much disorder in Germany after Frederick II that for 23 years, no emperor was elected. In 1273, Rudolf, Count of Habsburg, was elected emperor. A new family, that of Habsburg, now comes upon the scene. This was going to stick to the empire to the end. This family also came to an end as a ruling one during the Great War. The Emperor of Austria-Hungary at the time of the war was a Habsburg named Francis Joseph. He was a very old man, having been on the throne for over 60 years. His nephew and the heir to the throne was Franz Ferdinand, who was murdered with his wife in Sarajevo in Bosnia, in the Balkans, in 1914. It was this murder which brought on the Great War, and the war put an end to many things, among them the old dynasty of the Habsburgs. So much for the Holy Roman Empire. To the west of it, France and England were frequently at war with each other, and, more frequently, the king of each was at war with his big nobles. The kings triumphed over their nobles, far more than the emperor or king in Germany. And so England and France grew to be much more compact countries, and their unity gave them strength. In England, an event happened about this time of which you might have read. This was the signing of the Magna Charta by King John in 1215. A.C. John had succeeded his brother, Richard Coeur de Lion. He was very grasping, but he was also weak, and he succeeded in irritating everybody. The nobles cornered him at the island of Runnymede in the Thames and, almost at the sword's point, forced him to sign this Magna Charta, or Great Charter, which contained a promise that he would respect certain liberties of the nobles and people of England. This was the first big step in the long fight for political liberty in England. It was especially laid down that the king could not interfere with the property and liberty of any citizen without the consent of the man's equals. Out of this arose the jury system, where equals are supposed to judge. Thus in England, we find that the king's power was checked early. The theory of the supremacy of the ruler, which prevailed in the Holy Roman Empire, was not accepted in England even then. It is interesting to note that this rule laid down in England over 700 years ago does not apply to India even in 1932 under British rule. Today, one individual, the Viceroy, has power to issue ordinances, framing laws, and depriving people of their liberty and their property. Soon after Magna Carta, another notable event took place in England. A national council gradually grew up, to which knights and citizens were sent from the different country areas and the cities. This was the beginning of the English Parliament. The knights and citizens came to form the Commons House. The nobles and the bishops formed the Lords' House. This parliament had little power to begin with, but this grew gradually. Ultimately, there came the final test between the king and parliament as to who was supreme. The king lost his head, and parliament became undisputed master. But this was to take place after nearly 400 years, in the 17th century. In France also, there was a council of the three estates, as they were called. These three estates were the Lords, the Church, and the Commons. This council sometimes met when the king willed it, but its meetings were very infrequent, and it did not succeed in gaining the power which the English Parliament did. In France also, a king had to lose his head before the power of the kings was broken. In the East, the Eastern Roman Empire of the Greeks still continued. From its earliest days, it had been at war with someone or other, and often it seemed at the point of succumbing. Yet it survived. First the attack of northern barbarians, and then that of the Muslims. Of all the attacks that fell on the empire, from the Russians or Bulgarians or Arabs or the Seljuk Turks, the most deadly and harmful was the attack of the Crusaders. These Christian knights did more injury to Christian Constantinople than any infidel had done. From this great catastrophe, the empire and the city of Constantinople never recovered. The world of Western Europe was quite ignorant of the Eastern Empire. It cared little for it. It was hardly part of Christendom. Its language was Greek, while the learned language of Western Europe was Latin. As a matter of fact, even in the days of its decline, there was far more learning and literary activity in Constantinople than in the West. But it was the learning of the aged, without any strength or creative power behind it. The West had little learning, but it was young and had creative power. And soon this power was to break out in the creation of works of beauty. In the Eastern Empire, there was no conflict between the church and the emperor as in Rome. The emperor there was supreme, and he was quite despotic. There was no question of any freedom. The throne was the prize of the strongest or the most unscrupulous. By murder and trickery, through blood and crime, men gained the crown, and the people sheepishly obeyed them. It seemed to be immaterial to them who ruled. The Eastern Empire stood as a kind of sentinel at the gates of Europe, guarding them from Asiatic invasion. For many hundreds of years, it succeeded. The Arabs could not take Constantinople. The Seljuk Turks, although they came near it, could not take it. The Mongols passed it by and went north into Russia. Last came the Ottoman Turks, and to them fell the great prize of the imperial city of Constantinople in 1453 AC. And with the fall of the city fell also the Eastern Empire. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter number 64, The Rise of European Cities, June 21st, 1932. The period of the Crusades was the great period of faith in Europe, of common aspiration and belief. And the people sought relief from their daily misery in this faith and hope. There was no science, there was very little learning, for faith and science and learning do not easily go together. Learning and knowledge make people think, and doubt and questioning are difficult companions for faith to have. And the way of science is the way of inquiry and experiment, which is not the way of faith. We shall see later how this faith weakened and doubt arose. But for the moment, we see faith flourishing, and the Roman Church putting itself at the head of the faithful and often exploiting them. Many, many thousands of the faithful were sent to the Crusades in Palestine, never to return. The Pope also began to declare crusades against Christian people or groups in Europe who did not obey him in everything. The Pope and the Church even took advantage of this faith by issuing and often selling dispensations and indulgences. Dispensations were permissions to break some law or convention of the Church. Thus, the very laws which the Church made, it allowed to be set aside in special cases. Respect for such laws could hardly continue for long. Indulgences were even worse. According to the Roman Church, after death, a soul goes to purgatory, which is a place somewhere between heaven and hell, and there it suffers for the sins committed in this world. Afterwards, the soul is supposed to go to heaven. The Pope issued promises to people for payment that they would escape purgatory and go straight to heaven. Thus, the faith of the simple was exploited by the Church, and even out of crimes and what it considered sins, it made money. This practice of selling indulgences grew up sometime after the Crusades. It became a great scandal and was one of the reasons why many people turned against the Church of Rome. It is strange how much people with simple faith will put up with. It is because of this that religion has become one of the biggest and most paying businesses in many countries. See the priests in the temples, how they try to fleece the poor worshipper. Go to the banks of the Ganga, and you will see the pandas refusing to perform some ceremony till the unhappy villager pays up. Whatever happens in the family, a birth, a marriage, a death, the priest steps in and payment is required. In every religion, this is so. Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism. Each has its own methods of making money out of the faith of the faithful. In Hinduism, the methods are obvious enough. In Islam, there is supposed to be no priesthood, and in the past, this helped a little in protecting its followers from religious exploitation. But individuals and classes arose, calling themselves specialists in religion, learned men, Mavlavis and mullahs, and the like. And they imposed upon the simple Muslims of faith and exploited them. Wear a long beard or a tuft of hair on the crown of the head, or a long mark on the forehead, or a fakir's dress, or a sannyasin's yellow or ochre garb is a passport to holiness. It is not difficult to impose on the public. If you go to America, most advanced of countries, you will find there also that religion is a big industry living on the exploitation of the people. I have wandered far from the Middle Ages and the age of faith. We must go back to them. We find this faith taking visible and creative shape. In the 11th and 12th centuries, there is a great building period, and cathedrals spring up all over Western Europe. A new architecture appears, such as had not been seen in Europe before. By a clever device, the weight and stress of the heavy roofs are distributed to great buttresses outside the building. Inside, One is surprised to see delicate columns, apparently supporting the massive weight on top. There is a pointed arch taken from the Arab style of architecture. Above the whole building, there is a spire climbing up to the sky. This was the Gothic style of architecture, which was evolved in Europe. It was wondrously beautiful, and it seemed to represent soaring faith and aspiration. Truly, it represents that age of faith. Such buildings can only be built by architects and craftsmen in love
Their work and cooperating together in a great undertaking.
This rise of the Gothic in Western Europe is a surprising thing. Out of the welter of disorder and anarchy and ignorance and intolerance grew up this thing of beauty, almost like a prayer going up to the heavens. In France, northern Italy, Germany, and England, Gothic cathedrals grew up almost simultaneously. No one knows exactly how they began. No one knows the names of their architects. They seem to represent more the joint will and labor of the people as a whole than that of a single architect. Another new thing was the stained glass of the windows of the cathedrals. There were fine paintings in beautiful colors on these windows, and the light that came through them added to the solemn and awe-inspiring effect created by the building. Some little time ago, in one of my recent letters to you, I compared Europe with Asia. We saw that Asia was far more cultured and civilized than Europe at the time. And yet, in India, there was not much of creative work being done. And creation, I said, is the sign of life. This Gothic architecture coming out of semi-civilized Europe shows us that there was life enough there. In spite of the difficulties which disorder and a backward state of civilization present, this life breaks out and seeks methods of manifesting itself. The Gothic buildings were one of these manifestations. Later, we shall see it coming out in painting and sculpture and the love of adventure. You have seen some of these Gothic cathedrals. I wonder if you remember them. You visited the beautiful cathedral at Cologne in Germany. At Milan in Italy, there is a very fine Gothic cathedral. So also at Chartres in France. But I cannot name all these places. These cathedrals are spread out over Germany, France, England, and northern Italy. It is strange that in Rome itself, there is no Gothic building of note. During this great building period of the 11th and 12th centuries, non-Gothic churches were also put up, like the great Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris and probably St. Mark's in Venice. St. Mark's, which you have seen, is an example of Byzantine work and has beautiful mosaics. The age of faith declined, and with it, the building of churches and cathedrals. Men's thoughts turned in other directions, to their business and trade, to their civic life. Instead of cathedrals, city halls began to be built. So we find from the beginning of the 15th century beautiful Gothic town halls or guild halls scattered over northern and western Europe. In London, the Houses of Parliament are Gothic, but I do not know when they were built. I have an idea that the original Gothic building was burnt down and another one, also Gothic in style, was then built. These great Gothic cathedrals that rose up in the 11th and 12th centuries were situated in the towns and cities. The old cities were waking up and new towns were growing. There was a change all over Europe, and everywhere town life was increasing. In the old days of the Roman Empire, there were, of course, great towns all round the Mediterranean coast. But with the fall of Bourne and Greco-Roman civilization, these towns also decayed. Except for Constantinople, there was hardly a big city in Europe, apart from Spain, where the Arabs were. In Asia, in India, China, and the Arabian world, great cities flourished at this time. But Europe did not have them. Cities and culture and civilization seemed to go together. And Europe had none of these for a long time after the collapse of the Roman order. But now again, there was a revival of city life. In Italy especially, these cities grew. They were a thorn in the side of the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, for they would not agree to the suppression of certain liberties they had. These cities in Italy and elsewhere represent the growth of the merchant classes and the bourgeoisie or middle classes. Venice, lording it over the Adriatic Sea, had become a free republic. Beautiful as it is today, as the sea goes in and out through its winding canals, it is said that it was marshy land before the city was built. When Attila the Hun came down with fire and sword into Aquileia, some fugitives managed to escape to the marshes of Venice. They built themselves the city of Venice there, and situated as they were between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western, they managed to remain free. Trade came to Venice from India and the East and brought her riches. And she built up a navy and became a power on the sea. It was a republic of rich men with a president who was called a doge. This republic lasted till Napoleon entered Venice as a conqueror in 1797. It is said that the doge, who was a very old man, dropped down dead on that day. He was the last doge of Venice. On the other side of Italy was Genoa, also a great trading city of seafaring folk, a rival of Venice. In between was the university town of Bologna, and Pisa, and Verona, and Florence, which was to produce soon so many great artists, and which was going to shine brilliantly under the rule of the famous Medici family. Milan, also in northern Italy, was already an important manufacturing center. And in the south, Naples was growing. In France, Paris, which Hugh Capet had made his capital, was growing with the growth of France. Always Paris has been the nerve center and heart of France. There have been other capitals of other countries, but none of them, during the last 1,000 years, has dominated the country so much as Paris has dominated France. Other towns in France which become important are Lyon and Marseille, which was a very old port, Orléans, Bordeaux, and Boulogne. In Germany, as in Italy, the growth of the free cities is most notable, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries. Their population grows, and as their power and wealth increase, they grow bolder and fight the nobles. The emperor sometimes encouraged them, as he wanted to subdue the big nobles. These cities formed big commercial leagues and associations for defending themselves. Sometimes these associations or confederacies, as they were called, actually made war on counter-associations of nobles. Hamburg, Bremen, Cologne, Frankfurt, Munich, Danzig, Nuremberg, and Breslau were some of these growing cities. In the Netherlands, known as Holland and Belgium now, there were the cities of Antwerp, Bruges, and Ghent, commercial cities with an ever-growing business. In England, of course, there was London, but it could not then compete with the important cities of the continent in size or wealth or trade. The two universities of Oxford and Cambridge were growing in importance as centers of learning. In the east of Europe, there was the city of Vienna, one of the oldest in Europe, and in Russia there were Moscow and Kiev and Novgorod. These new cities, or most of them, must be distinguished from the old-style imperial cities. The importance of the rising cities of Europe was not due to any emperor or king, but to the trade that they controlled. Their strength lay, therefore, not in the nobles, but in the merchant classes. They were merchant cities. The rise of the cities, therefore, means the rise of the bourgeoisie. This bourgeoisie, we shall see later, went on increasing in power, till it successfully challenged king and noble and seized power from them. But this was to happen long after the period we are considering. Cities and civilization often go together, I have just said. With the growth of cities, learning also grows and the spirit of freedom. Men living in rural areas are scattered and are often very superstitious. They seem to be at the mercy of the elements. They have to work hard and have little leisure, and they dare not disobey their lords. In cities, large numbers live together. They have the opportunity of living a more civilized life, of learning, of discussing and criticizing, and of thinking. So the spirit of freedom grows both against political authority, as represented by the feudal nobles, and against the spiritual authority, as represented by the church. The age of faith declines, and doubt begins. The authority of the Pope and of the Church is not always blindly obeyed. We saw how the Emperor Frederick II treated the Pope. We shall see this spirit of defiance growing. There was also a revival of learning from the 12th century onwards. Latin was the common language of the learned in Europe, and men in quest of knowledge traveled from one university to another. Dante Alighieri, the great Italian poet, was born in 1265. Petrarch, another great poet of Italy, was born in 1304. A little later, Chaucer, the earliest of the great English poets, flourished in England. But even more interesting than the revival of learning were the fault beginnings of the scientific spirit, which was to grow so much in after years in Europe. You will remember my telling you that the Arabs had this spirit and worked according
To it to some extent. It was difficult for such a spirit of inquiry, with an open mind and of experiment, to exist in Europe during the Middle Ages. The Church would not tolerate it. But in spite of the Church, it begins to be visible. One of the first persons who had this scientific spirit at this time in Europe was an Englishman, Roger Bacon. He lived at Oxford in the 13th century. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter number 65,
The Afghans invade India. June 23, 1932. My letter to you was interrupted yesterday. As I sat down to write, I forgot the jail and my surroundings here and traveled, with the speed of thought, back to the world of the Middle Ages. But I was brought back, with even greater speed, to the present, and was made rather painfully conscious of the jail. I was told that orders had come from above, forbidding interviews with Mummy and Didaji, one for a month. Why? I was not told. Why should a prisoner be told? They have been here in Dehradun for 10 days now, waiting for the next interview day. And now their waiting has been to no purpose, and they must go back. Such is the courtesy extended to us. Well, well, we must not mind. It is all in the day's work, and prison is prison, and we had better not forget it. It was not possible for me to leave the present for the past after this rude awakening. But I feel a little better today, after a night's rest. So I begin afresh. We shall come back to India now. We have been away long enough. What was happening here while Europe was trying to struggle out of the darkness of the Middle Ages? When the people there were crushed under the weight of the feudal system and the general disorder and misgovernment that prevailed? When Pope and Emperor struggled against each other, and the countries of Europe took shape? When Christianity and Islam struggled for mastery during the Crusades? Already, we have had a glimpse of India during the early Middle Ages. We have also seen Sultan Mahmud swoop down from Ghazni in the northwest to the rich plains of northern India and plunder and destroy. Mahmud's raids, terrible as they were, produced no great or lasting change in India. They gave a great shock to the country, especially the north, and numerous fine monuments and buildings were destroyed by him. But only Sindh and a part of the Punjab remained in the empire of Ghazni. The rest of the north recovered soon enough. The south was not even touched, nor was Bengal. For another 150 years or more after Mahmud, neither Muslim conquest nor Islam made much progress in India. It was towards the end of the 12th century, about 1186 AC, that a fresh wave of invasion came from the northwest. An Afghan chief had arisen in Afghanistan, who captured Ghazni and put an end to the Ghaznavite Empire. He is called Shahab-ud-din Ghuri, Gur being some little town in Afghanistan. He came down to Lahore, took possession of it, and then marched to Delhi. The king of Delhi was Prithvi Raj Chauhan, and under his leadership, many other chiefs of northern India fought against the invader and defeated him utterly. But only for a while. Shahab-ud-din returned next year with a great force, and this time he defeated and killed Prithvi Raj. Prithvi Raj is still a popular hero, and there are many legends and songs about him. The most famous of these is about his eloping with the daughter of Raja Jaichandra of Kanauj. But the elopement cost him dear. It cost him the lives of his bravest followers and the enmity of a powerful king. It sowed the seeds of dissension and mutual conflict, and thus made it easy for the invader to win. Thus, in 1192 AC, was won the first great victory by Shahab-ud-din, which resulted in the establishment of Muslim rule in India. Slowly the invaders spread, east and south. In another 150 years, by 1340, Muslim rule extended over a great part of the south. Then it began to shrink in the south. New states arose, some Muslim, some Hindu, notably the Hindu Empire of Vijayanagar. For 200 years, Islam lost ground to some extent, and it was only when the great Akbar came, in the middle of the 16th century, that it spread again across nearly the whole of India. The coming of the Muslim invaders into India produced many reactions. Remember that these invaders were Afghans, and not Arabs or Persians, or the cultured and highly civilized Muslims of Western Asia. From the point of view of civilization, these Afghans were backward as compared to Indians. But they were full of energy and far more alive than India was at the time. India was too much in a rut. It was becoming unchanging and unprogressive. It stuck to the old ways and made no attempt to better them. Even with regard to methods of warfare, India was backward, and the Afghans were far better organized. So in spite of courage and sacrifice, the old India went down before the Muslim invader. These Muslims were fierce and cruel enough to begin with. They came from a hard country where softness was not much appreciated. Added to this was the fact that they were in a newly conquered country, surrounded by enemies who might revolt at any moment. Fear of rebellion must have been ever present, and fear often produces cruelty and frightfulness. So there were massacres to cow down the people. It was not a question of a Muslim killing a Hindu because of his religion, but a question of an alien conqueror trying to break the spirit of the conquered. Religion is almost always brought in to explain these acts of cruelty, but this is not correct. Sometimes religion was used as a pretext. 15 Lut, the real causes were political or social. The people from Central Asia who invaded India were fierce and merciless even in their homelands and long before they were converted to Islam. Having conquered a new country, they knew only one way of keeping it under control: the way of terror. Gradually, however, we find India toning down these fierce warriors and civilizing them. They begin to feel as if they were Indians and not foreign invaders. They marry women of the country, and the distinction between invader and the invaded slowly lessens. It will interest you to know that Mahmud of Ghazni, who was the greatest destroyer that northern India had known, and who is said to have been a champion of Islam against the idolaters, had a Hindu army corps under a Hindu general named Tilak. He took Tilak and Immi's army to Ghazni and used him to put down rebellious Muslims. So you will see that for Mahmud, the object was conquest. In India, he was prepared to kill idolaters with the help of his Muslim soldiers. In Central Asia, he was equally prepared to kill Muslims with the help of his Hindu soldiers. Islam shook up India. It introduced vitality and an impulse for progress in a society which was becoming wholly unprogressive. Hindu art, which had become decadent and morbid, and heavy with repetition and detail, undergoes a change in the north. A new art grows up, which might be called Indo-Muslim, full of energy and vitality. The old Indian master builders draw inspiration from the new ideas brought by the Muslims. The very simplicity of the Muslim creed and outlook on life influenced the architecture of the day and brought back to it simple and noble design. The first effect of the Muslim invasion was an exodus of people to the south. After Mahmud's raids and massacres, Islam was associated in northern India with barbarous cruelty and destruction. So when the new invasion came and could not be checked, Crowds of skilled craftsmen and learned men went to southern India. This gave a great impetus to Aryan culture in the south. I have told you already something of the south, how the Chalukyas were the dominant power in the west and center, the Maharashtra country, from the middle of the 6th century onwards for 200 years. Huan Sang visited Pulakeshin II, who was the ruler then. Then came the Bashtrakutas, who defeated the Chalukyas and dominated the south for another 200 years, from the 8th to nearly the end of the 10th century. These Bashtrakutas were on the best of terms with the Arab rulers of Sindh, and many Arab traders and travelers visited them. One such traveler has left an account of his visit. He tells us that the ruler of the Bashtrakutas of the time, 9th century, was one of the 4 great monarchs of the world. The other 3 great monarchs were, in his opinion, the Caliph of Baghdad, the Emperor of China, and the Emperor of Rome, that is, Constantinople. This is interesting as showing what the prevalent opinion in Asia must have been at the time. For an Arab traveler to compare the kingdom of the Rashtrakutas with the Caliph's empire, when Baghdad was at the height of its glory and power, means that this kingdom of Maharashtra must have been very strong and powerful. These Rashtrakutas gave place again to the Chalukyas in the 10th century, 973 AC, and these remained in power again for over 200 years, up to 1190 AC. There is a long poem about one of these Chalukyan kings, and in this it is stated that he was chosen by his wife at a public Swayamvar. It is interesting to find this old Aryan custom surviving for so long. Farther south and east in India lay the Tamil country. Here, from the 3rd century to the 9th, for about 600 years, the Pallavas ruled. And for 200 years, beginning from the middle of the 6th century, they dominated the south. You will remember that it was these Pallavas who sent out colonizing expeditions to Malaysia and the eastern islands. The capital of the Pallava state was Kanchi or Conjeevaram, a beautiful city then and even now remarkable for its wise town planning. The Pallavas give place to the aggressive Cholas early in the 10th century. I have told you something of the Chola Empire of Rajaraja and Rajendra, who built great fleets and went conquering to Ceylon, Burma, and Bengal. More interesting is the information we have of the elective village panchayat system they had. This system was built up from below. Village unions electing many committees to look after various kinds of work, and also electing district unions. Several districts formed a province. I have often, in these letters, laid stress on this village panchayat system, as this was the backbone of the old Aryan polity. About the time of the Afghan invasions in northern India, the Cholas were dominant in southern India. Soon, however, they began to decline, and a little kingdom, which was subordinate to them, became independent and grew in power. This was the Pandya kingdom, with Madura for its capital and Kayal as its port. A famous traveler from Venice, Marco Polo, about whom I shall have something more to say later, visited Kayal, the port, twice, in 1288 and in 1293. He describes the town as a great and noble city, full of ships from Arabia and China, and humming with business. Marco himself came by ship from China. Marco Polo also tells us that the finest muslins, which look like tissue of spider's web, were made on the east coast of India. Marco mentions that a lady, Rudramani Devi, was the queen in the Telugu country, that is, the east coast north of Madras. This lady ruled for 40 years, and she is highly praised by Marco. Another interesting piece of information we get from Marco is that large numbers of horses were imported into southern India by sea from Arabia and Persia. The climate of the south was not suitable for horse breeding. It is said that one of the reasons why the Muslim invaders of India were better fighters was their possession of the better horses. The best horse breeding grounds in Asia were under their control. The Pandya kingdom was thus the leading Tamil power in the 13th century when the Cholas declined. Early in the 14th century, in 1310, the Muslim wedge of invasion reached south. It drove into the Pandya kingdom, which rapidly collapsed. I have surveyed South Indian history in this letter and perhaps repeated what I had previously said. But the subject is a little confusing and people get mixed up between the Pallavas and the Chalukyas and Cholas and the rest of them. And yet, if you look at it as a whole, you may be able to fit the broad framework into your mind. Ashoka, you will remember, ruled over the whole of India except for a tiny tip at the bottom, and Afghanistan and part of Central Asia. After him rose, in the south, the Andhra power, which extended right across the Deccan and lasted for 400 years, about the time that the Kushans had their borderland empire in the north. As the Telugu Andhras decline, the Tamil Pallavas rise on the east coast and the south, and for a very long period they hold sway. They colonize in Malaysia. After 600 years of rule, they give place to the Cholas, who conquer distant lands and sweep the seas with their navies. 300 years later, they retire from the scene, and the Pandyan kingdom emerges into prominence, and the city of Madura becomes a center of culture, and Kayal, a great and busy port in touch with distant countries. So much for the south and east. On the west, in the Maharashtra country, there were the Chalukyas and then the Rashtrakutas, and then again, for a second time, the Chalukyas. All these are just names. But consider the long periods for which these kingdoms lasted, and the high degree of civilization attained. There was an inner strength which seems to have given more stability and peace to them than the kingdoms of Europe had. But the social structure had outlived its day, and the stability had gone. It was soon to topple over when the Muslim armies moved southward early in the 14th century. Dear friends and students, till now you were listening to the book Glimpses of World History by the legendary Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Please subscribe to the channel and help us grow. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.